let's talk about VueJS and why I think it could be something interesting for you to consider VueJS for your next web project or for maybe for your running project. And first, I know I quickly talked or so, but if I haven't introduced myself, I'm Rowan. I'm currently the senior front-end scientist at CodeShip and also happy father since April, so that's why we're a family-friendly company. Thanks. And as I just heard, book references is a good thing here. I can recommend only The Age of Cryptocurrency if you're interested in cryptocurrency stuff or so. It has a very good detail on the history of money and so just a good book I can totally recommend. But let's get on with the real stuff. So first, if you have not heard of Vue so far, you may ask, okay, what is Vue? And the first thing I learned after 3 months of using it, you pronounce it Vue, not Vue or something like this. So it's just Vue like everything else. And I would say it's the V in a MV whatever pattern. And also what's important is that it's not another framework, it's more a library than a framework. And I would say it's closer to something like React from what it does or what's its purpose. And initially it was built by Evan You to be a tool to quickly build certain prototypes. He was also a web developer and he wanted to have something where he has data coming from somewhere or even a JSON object, and he just wants to have this data pretty fast in the UI and want to create interactivity, and he was not happy with the tools he had. So this was his initial thought about the first version or when he started the Vue project. And even if it sounds pretty new, if some of you just heard today about it or the last few weeks, it was actually started in 2014 already. So it's quite a matured project so far and very well supported. Yeah. But before we dive a little bit more into the Vue syntax itself, an interesting pattern I quickly want to talk about, because that was something very, I would say, eye-opening for me when working with this kind of stuff. And that's a data-driven versus a DOM-driven UI. And if you see what I mean with this, DOM-driven is something, imagine you have something super simple. I'm not sure, maybe it's not ideal to see this black editor code. But you just have a diff element with a class, some class, and you have some JavaScript behind it, and we just talked about jQuery briefly before. And what we have is here a function that's just returning a string. And what we do is with jQuery, we say, okay, some element, we want to have this text of the function put in there. So what happens actually when we rename this file, we call it some underscore element because we want to use the BAM pattern now in naming. Our JavaScript is pretty much broken. Our code just stopped working. But what actually broke there is what I would do first is kind of say, okay, I know totally what's happening. I will go to my code or so, we'll update the jQuery binding, say, okay, this is the new class there, and everything is fine and everything is working again. But this is after the initial thought, I would actually think about, okay, what happened for real? And actually the data behind it is fine because we still have our function that's returning a string of hello world, but what broke is the binding to this class. So this is what I would call a DOM-driven approach because your JavaScript and everything you do is very tightly coupled to how you name your classes, your elements. And this is something I experienced a lot when working with jQuery. You had this kind of very complex, maybe UI element forms or so, and you were clicking on something and a product manager decided, hey, I want to have this completely different, and you have to revamp the whole UI a little bit over there. And suddenly you have to recode most of your JavaScript again, have to update all the bindings, see, okay, I use this data attribute over there. So you have a really tightly coupled between your JavaScript code and your HTML. And separation of concern is something that gets lost very soon. So what's happening when you do something data-driven? This is definitely code that will look very familiar to everybody. So in the first line, you have some element like we had before, but we have these curly braces like in almost every JavaScript template language these days, and we have our message in there. And in this case, we just use a little plain view function. And all we do there, we have defined a data object and say, okay, there's the message hello world in there. So obviously, when we change now a class from some element to something else, it's not breaking anything. So the binding is completely loose or is not kind of coupled to your data behind it. I would say that looks just like Angular and everything, and React is much better. These are the kind of comments I hear very fast and very often when you do this kind of code. And yeah, and people start raising, what about this framework? This is way better than that. And so I think these are good questions. I think you should think about or kind of really ask behind it. And so I want to show you what made Vue stand out for me and why I thought it was the right chance or right tool for us to use in our kind of moving forward in our CodeShip application. So what made Vue stand out? First of all, when I started kind of investigating what were better frameworks than we use right now, Vue was super approachable. So the documentation there is one of the best I've ever seen. And you had kind of this familiarity from Angular. I was working a lot with Angular already and built some bigger applications with it in the past. So it was kind of nice to see the comfort of Angular there. Like with your data bindings in the UI, this is something that's very nice to have actually. And experience I had in other projects in the past is even designers or somebody else or so, he can very quickly do these little tweaks in your templates. He has not to understand how the JavaScript behind it works, but it will automatically work and he can work with the templates and repeat stuff over there. And that's very nice to work with. This is a comfort that you don't have in something like React, where you first would need to learn something like JSX to do it. In Vue, you can just drop it into your page like any other library, like jQuery or whatever, and it just works. You can just use it out of the box. That was pretty nice. And what I also liked about it, it was very flexible, and it's not so opinionated about how it wants you to do things. It more gives you kind of like just a little tool, and you can do with it whatever you like. So if you understand functions and objects in JavaScript, then you can pretty much do everything with VueJS. So it doesn't require you to learn everything. I would say if you spend 1 day or so with Vue, first day ever, I would say you have about 90% of the library, how it works, and you can do everything you like. It was pretty cool. Beside that, Vue was also reactive. So React is always this kind of buzzword, and actually something reactive is something kind of very familiar now in JavaScript, like Angular 2 says, okay, we're reactive on many points, and Vue is also kind of fulfilling this. And what's very nice there, it uses kind of plain JavaScript, so it will create observable variables and everything, does it for you, does nice bindings. And so whenever you change a variable, all the other variables will know what need to change and how to react correctly. So this is something that's very nice. And also something that it doesn't have is this auto two-way binding. I was very familiar from Angular, where it's just, okay, you have an ng model over here, text over there, and whenever change it will automatically bind to the other thing. This is not baked in for performance side, but if you need it or so, it's like just one word you add. You want to sync a variable, and then it's kind of two-way binded. That's pretty nice. And I would say what's the biggest change or difference if you compare it to something like React? A lot of people think that the speed of React is because it's using virtual DOM and leveraging this. And actually, that's not the point, because Vue uses real DOM references. So you can make your templates, or you can define them in the components or wherever, but it will create real DOM references and uses those. And it's very, very fast. So sometimes it's even faster than React, or at least as fast. It's always depending on a spec, like there are libraries that are very good at one thing, and there's one spec where like this library is not so suitable, but will totally outperform something else on another spec. And all of this, kind of while looking at it, for me, it hit the sweet spot between performance and the ease of use. And this is something very important when you move something in. And all of this brought the question, okay, why did we then really choose VueJS? So I can quickly show you what our challenge was. So we have this view up here as a part of our product, and it's split up in two parts, I would say. Where left we have certain steps or so that are referenced to your tests and kind of services that run, and the right side is kind of just like a terminal log output. And we all do this, of course, on the server in the backend, so we don't have the log output, so we have to send it to the client and render all those lines there. And obviously a log can produce a ton of log lines. So this was something very challenging, how to work with this amount of data. And so our problems we faced is we wanted to fix the performance problems we were facing. So sometimes the browser froze at some points when the log was pretty large. It even crashed sometimes, what was not a nice experience. Also, we wanted to allow kind of efficient rendering for complex objects. Like we have objects that have various keys and values in there. And I would say a rough estimation, if you have 10,000 objects, they would create around 30 to 45,000 DOM nodes, depending on the content, the coloring and everything. So it was quite a lot, actually. And also what was important for us, we wanted to make the code behind it more accessible, because it was not too well written, I would say, and very confusing. And that's something I see very often when you try to be very smart, and it even happens to me. I tried to create smart code, and a week later I have no idea what I did there because it was too smart for me, actually. So this was one thing, and also another very important thing, we want to move very fast. We want to improve our product very quickly. So we wanted to keep the overhead of introducing a new technology to a minimum, because we couldn't afford to do just half a year this and update the whole tool chain just to make the right choice and introduce something super big. So this was very important to us. We had this problem, and we needed to fix this problem as soon as possible and as fast as possible. And as you asked before, what we were using previously, and we used Angular. So I really like Angular, but in this case, it turned out to be the wrong tool for the job. It's just to say, okay, we have it in some other parts of the application, so it made sense to use it for this as well. And there we ran into a lot of problems over time. So after some investigation, we were able to trace the big problem down in the scope used by Angular. So if you update your DOM, Angular will start to try to take care of everything. So we even did kind of like optimizations where we used inner HTML and injected everything there just to not use the for loops of Angular and avoid dirty checking wherever possible, but it just kind of went nuts at some point. So I see I need to go a little faster. Sorry for that. So yeah, for the ease of implementation, as I said before, we have no time for a new build tool. I wanted to use something like Webpack, introduce Gulp and something like this, but our application was built on Rails. And there we have our asset pipeline, and we have a lot of stuff in there like CoffeeScript, jQuery, Angular. So yeah, it's kind of always choose the right tool for a job, and it's very, very hard. So the first thing I did is, by investigating, I did it with a lot of tools, but I built some prototypes. And to be very, very fast with those, I built them on CodePen. And what I tried first is just to have 10K lines rendered quickly. And it was actually, I was amazed how fast it was in Vue. And the code were 15 lines or so it was just working out of the box. That was pretty amazing. And then another thing was a 1 megabyte file with the object. I think there were around 30, 40,000 objects. I rendered them. It took about 4 seconds or so for Vue till it had all those dumped into the DOM. And that was pretty cool. So I did not optimize anything there. It was just plain Vue, just drop a megabyte file in there and was just working. That was pretty cool. And I was very impressed by this. So I said, okay, let's move forward after kind of all those prototypes and look at the implementation of this. So the first step I did is I kind of started to rebuild the view you saw before. We have our app, and I would say we have our sidebar we saw with all the steps. And there we create, okay, we have a service in there, and we want to do something for an array of services. We just want to print those out. And this is like also the introduction a little bit to see how Vue itself looks and behaves. So we do this loop, and it's a v4 service and services. It's pretty much, and our Vue object behind it was pretty straightforward, just like this. So as you see on top, we have our element binding. That's the app. This is, I would say, the only binding in Vue you would ever need or use. That's pretty much like you ng control in Angular, where you say, okay, this is the point of entry, take care of the rest inside there. So we had our services, and this was just an array of objects. We printed it out, and it was, yeah, pretty straightforward. And as you expected or so with our loop, this is the DOM we got. So nothing new there, I would say. So I moved forward. Okay, second step, I want to move this inside a component because components are super cool. And also, I want to be flexible at some point. I want to have services will get a little bit complex, we'll have certain classes, we'll do something more. I don't know it yet, I will go over it in the future, but I know, okay, I want to build a component for this. So what I did is I started writing the markup first. I said, okay, I will have a chat service. Chat is our tool, as we named before. And I see, okay, for each service or so, it should render this one. And all I did there is like, this is your binding. You say, okay, you want to pass some value down to the component itself. And I just pass the service of the array down to the binding and say, okay, this is my link for the component. I hope this is a little bit readable. So this is how we create a component. I just create a new class. I say, okay, view extend. I give it a name like chat service. I say props. This is just where I reference the binding I created. And then you say, okay, the template, and there you also see you can do inline templating. So we could use the template and build it inside our other HTML, but we can also do inline templating in our component itself. And there we do actually pretty much the same like we did before. We just wrapped our template inside a component. And we do the same here and say, okay, we reference now the component and say, please view this application part, please take care of this chat service component, it will be referenced in there. And then we had the next problem, like we had steps. Steps were pretty much the same like services, but you had steps and steps could have nested steps. This was one of the big problems I always faced in Angular with nested stuff each other. You have to write pretty weird script ng template stuff or so to just reference each other. I went nuts on this in the past, and our old code was also pretty crazy. So how did I do it? I just created a computed value that said, okay, look if this is a grouped step, if this has more steps in it. And what I did there is just say, okay, for my template, render the step as you said, and oh, check if it's a group step. So it has like another step in there and say it's a group step. Then we say, okay, render, self-reference the template again and render it itself in the component. And it just works, so you can do kind of infinite nesting or so. This is all you need to do. No weird ng template stuff. This works. And what Evan, you said, the creator view, is always kind of thoughts and simple versus easy. Why not build something that's simple and easy? So the next thing I did is, just to really verify what I was doing there, is to create benchmarks for what I'm doing. And for this, we had a test that's called circrash 5000. And all it did was it would create 5,000 random lines and dump it down to a service. And this is kind of pretty much how one of those objects looked like. We had a timestamp, we had a service name reference in there, and a payload that was actually a base64 decoded string. So the old way, how we did it with Angular, we decoded actually the payload on the server because Angular would totally crash on encoding all those lines locally. So we decoded the lines, we pre-rendered all lines on the server and the template, and what we actually did is we sent the HTML string through HX down to the client, and then we inner HTML'd this HTML string into the UI. Pretty amazing, yep. But I thought, okay, the new way should be way more efficient. So I want to send the raw objects, and I want to send them to the client through HX, because maybe later I can do something like WebSockets and everything and stream the data down. Then I don't want to go over a server. I would just want to grab the real data from the log output as fast as possible. And then I want to decode and colorize the payload, everything. And also I want to have kind of a complete client state to see what was the user doing, which step was active, what log was there, and everything like this. So actually, with Angular, we had some problems, and we already created some extra breathing room already by 8,000 lines of log. They would create, like I said before, about 32,000 DOM elements, and Angular was sometimes not very happy there. But with 8,000 lines now, and so this was working with the inner HTML trick we did or so. So we had this custom worker with the inner HTML, as I said. And as a benchmark, just to give you a quick overview, what we did is kind of, if you dispatch the event, that would be kind of click on one of the services or steps. This is kind of the time it takes. Okay, what happens then? Then we go to the server, say, okay, give me all those. Then we pre-render the lines and everything on the server, prepare the HTML. Then we finally send it down. So this is kind of the promised result, I would say. That's pretty much one of those in the end. Please ignore those little ripples up there. That's something from intercom, kind of interfering all the time or so. But you always have those in there. Then we had this HTML string, we rendered it down, and then as we had this worker to kind of broke those lines down to kind of create the efficiency, every chunk I created was about 60 milliseconds it took to render and put into the DOM. And I would say in totally for our 5,000 lines, it took about 6,000 or 6 seconds till kind of Angular was done with those lines, and just made it to a total time of a little bit over 6 seconds till you would see something on your side, or that's even though only the performance it needed to render all those. Then we looked at the same thing with the same weird approach where you just render the HTML string and dump it into the UI with Vue. And there I was able to cut it down to about 2 seconds from performance, from necessary CPU time. So like only if you look at something like this patching of an event with a click, what should be pretty straightforward, it was painfully slow in Angular because Angular needed to kind of dirty check everything and what was actually clicked and why was this clicked and everything. And just a simple click event would take a lot of CPU time actually. So yeah, let's make this even a little bit better. And I came to the point where I say, okay, we optimized everything, had the rendering on the client and everything. And what you see here is that actually our time went a little bit up. So we are now at 3,000 or a little bit over 3 seconds. But what we do here is we really completely decode the payload on the client, colorize everything, dump it into the UI. So we do a lot of more and kind of free up a lot of process time on the server. All of this made Vue very appealing, and Vue had a very rich ecosystem beside it, like Vue state management, Vue resources, router, everything. And Vue 2 is also on the horizon already, so it's a pretty cool tool. Are there any questions?
1, 2, 3, good. So when you made the benchmarks, did you do that before Angular introduced the one-time binding or afterwards?
It was with the one-time binding. So we used it where possible. And was the latest version of Angular 1.
So it's really like an up-to-date comparison kind of. Okay.
Yeah.
Next question, over here.
Did you consider just ViennaJS? Because like most of the frameworks, Ember, Angular, even React, Flux, like they're absolutely not optimized for dumping a few thousand lines just on the DOM, right? So that's why it's slow. Like there's no other reason. Did you? But it's a fairly like they're optimized for asynchronous workflows, for interaction with users, for nested asynchronous calls. Did you just consider writing an efficient algorithm in ViennaJS for exactly this problem?
I really considered it first because I said, okay, plain JS is the best thing you could do, but it turned out that Vue was for me so simple and it had the little nice things I would like to just use and leverage wherever possible, and I don't want to create like everything the Avenue created again just to say, okay, I'm maybe 5 milliseconds faster. Just for the sake of, and here you can spend save thousands of development hours just using this tool with component and infinite nesting and everything. It's kind of hard to write on your own.
Because it was more or less optimized
out
the box for your use case.
And Vue focus only on the view and tries to be very efficient there. And that's for me a point where
one more question? Yeah. The way you talked about Vue is exactly how I will talk about Knockout. Did you consider Knockout, and if you did, did you choose VueJS or
So he asked me if I considered Knockout.js before, because it's the same way he would talk about Knockout. And yeah, I worked with Knockout in the past, and probably me and Knockout, we had a bad start, I would say. So yeah, I didn't like all the bindings and where you have this Knockout observables that you would define a lot of logic actually on little pieces of template, and I just didn't like it. I just want to use functions and objects wherever possible and keep the logic in the DOM I need to write to a bare minimum, and that's what kind of knocked it out. Thank you.
Thank you for watching this talk. Down below you can find our channel ViennaJS, where you can find a lot of different videos about front-end and back-end JavaScript, and feel free to subscribe.